All right. Well, thanks a lot, John. Well, welcome again, everybody. And I'm just going to turn the meeting over to our beloved Andre and Marianne Robbie.
Thank you. Well, it is an absolute joy for us to join you again. And I'm just going to make sure I'm going to ask Mary Ann to start us off with another song as well. And then we'll get into the message.
After I finished clunking Andre on the head. Won't you be still for a moment? Silence is calling you into the depths of the mystery, beyond what you can see. You'll find me waiting. No judgment, no temporary fixes. In love's community, a whole new world of meaning unfolds inside of you. Whispers of desire, breathing life into the formless chaos, rivers of kindness and mercy, as healing flows in ancient wisdom, yet new as the dawn. There's no judgment, no temporary fixes. This is love's community. A whole new world of meaning unfolds inside of you. And there is no fear here. Love is loving you. There is no fear here. Love is loving you. Whispers of desire, breathing life into the formless chaos, rivers of kindness and mercy, as healing flows in ancient wisdom, yet new as the dawn. No judgment, no temporary fixes. In love's community, a whole new world unfolding inside of you. And you are seen, you're desired into being. Love is loving you. You are seen, desired into being, and love
So easy. Thank you, Mary Ann. Now in John 14, verse 27, Jesus said, "My peace I leave with you, not as the world gives their peace, but this peace no one can take from you. Therefore, do not let your hearts be troubled, neither be fearful." And that's really, for me, the aim of where we want to go to this morning with this message, is to that place where peace becomes tangible. And the stuff that can be so troubling, the way in which we engage with our world that produces fear, that we can find a different way of engaging with our world. Because now all of us are involved in the narratives and the stories of our world. And many of these stories, many of these narratives are disturbing. There are stories that can steal your joy, narratives that can feed your anxiety, stories that can continue to feed the fear. And it's not just the stories we are bombarded with in the media. We also continually develop our own narratives. We develop our own stories. And the way in which we construct our stories, the way in which we construct meaning. And when I speak about constructing stories, creating meaning, it doesn't mean that any of us sits down on a daily basis and decide what is my story and writing it down. It is this continual voice, this continual narrative that all of us are familiar with, a story that keeps on running. The way in which we make sense of our world, the way in which we view our reality, that is this, our narratives, our story. It's that story I'm talking about. So I want to look at two ways in which we engage with narratives and in which we construct our narratives. The first is a way that all of us will be familiar with. It's a way of constructing our stories that's so deeply embedded within the human psyche that we are often blind to the fact that we are involved in it. It just comes rather naturally. And then secondly, we're going to look at how Jesus gives us a new way of interpreting our world, a new way of constructing stories, so that what he prays in John 14, verse 27 can actually become a reality. Because when he says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled," have any of you ever wondered, how the heck do I do that? How can I not fear in the midst of all these voices and events, etc.? Well, Jesus did not make an unreasonable demand. He spoke about the reality that he tasted himself. And so I just want to start with praying. Jesus, we thank you for inviting us into this new way of understanding, of being human, a way in which peace reigns in our hearts. We thank you that you said that it is to our advantage that you go away, so that the Spirit of truth, the one who reveals our Abba to us, can become a reality in a way that he hasn't been before. And so, Spirit of truth, we just welcome you now. Why don't each one of you, where you at, just in your own words, say, "Spirit of truth, I welcome you. I welcome you to show me even the things that I might not be comfortable with." because I know all that you show me is to my benefit. Thank you, Papa. Thank you, Abba. So, two ways of constructing our stories. Now, the first way that I want to start off with is some of the most ancient stories ever constructed. The first attempts that humans made to put meaning into a format that can be preserved, the ancient myths, can give us enormous insight into the way in which humans construct meaning and construct stories. Now, Rene Girard gave us some amazing insights into these myths. You know, today when we hear the word myth, we often just think that's just a tall tale. It's just a fantasy. That's the way in which we use the word myth today. But if we think of the literary genre called mythology, those stories preserve something very precious, something very truthful, but they also show us the way in which we use language to deceive. So it's not just pure truth, neither is it pure fantasy. Gerard, in his studies of all the mythology across different cultures and across the world, realized that these stories have similar structures because they were real events that gave birth to these stories. And that's why whether you go to China or ancient Greece or all these origin myths have got a similar structure because similar events stir up similar ways of us trying to construct meaning around those events. So what I want you to keep in mind as well as I start speaking about these ancient myths is that this is not something that's far removed from you because of time. I think you will start realizing that much of the stories that we are currently exposed to, and many of the stories that we tell ourselves, are basically following the same mythic structure. Each one of us constructs our own myths. And it's that I want to shine a light on so that we can see how to move towards the love of truth, where Jesus gives us a new way of telling our stories. So let's start with, what did these ancient origin myths have in common? One of the first things Gerard noticed is in many of these stories, there's the monster of chaos. Or as he would interpret it, it's a community in real crisis. A community is about to lose their identity, maybe even lose their existence. And the way in which they try and describe this crisis is to say it's a monstrous chaos. Now, this is very interesting because it shows us that in times of crisis, we invent stories. In times of crisis, when all the boundaries and all the familiar categories with which we understand our world, when that starts crumbling, we are desperate for meaning. And so we try and, in the midst of this chaos, find a new way of associating meanings and creating a new story so that at least we can make sense of a world that is busy falling apart. Now, this community in crisis, what we know not only through the mythology, but through the actual archaeology and the history as they looked at these ancient stories, is that many of the small communities in this ancient world, communities who doesn't have a strong structure of law, etc., violence would very often destroy these small communities, because violence starts as maybe a small dispute between two families. But very soon, the very nature of violence means it escalates. And if you killed one of my family, we're going to kill one of your family. And very soon, the whole community gets sucked into rivalry. And often, a community ceased to exist because violence would just disrupt this whole community. But all across the world, they found a solution to this profane kind of violence. And it was a new kind of violence, which they called a sacred violence. Sacred because it actually saved their community from extinction. And this kind of violence meant that instead of everyone killing everyone, and instead of a war of all against all, let's find one community, one person, one outcast, and let's all turn our frustration and anger onto the one and sacrifice that one to the gods so that peace can be restored in our community. So this is another interesting part about the way in which humans constructed meaning from the very earliest days. When there is chaos, when there is crisis, it seems natural for us to try and find the source of the problem, the source of this chaos outside of ourselves. Now, very interestingly, this is another insight for which René Girard's very famous, and that is the understanding of the way in which desire works. Because we don't suddenly wake up one day and our community is in crisis. What happened is many small little conflicts, many small little irritations, many small little suggestions keeps on building momentum. And so his insight around the actual source of conflict is very reminiscent of what Genesis 3 tells us about the very origin of where humanity misinterpreted their story. Because Girard tells us that desire is not something that spontaneously erupts between a person and the object of desire. Rather, desire is always mediated. So let's think back about that primitive community again, where let's make it maybe an agricultural community in which a person sees the farmer next to him, and this farmer has got the most beautiful brown cows, but he doesn't have brown cows. Suddenly, the person observing the other one with brown cows realizes that's what's missing in my life. I need brown cows. So desire, Girard tells us, never just occurs between a person and the object of desire. We desire according to another. Now, doesn't this remind you of Genesis 3? Remember, we're trying to now find out, where does the crisis and the chaos begin? And it begins not with a guilty party outside of us. It always begins with a whispering voice that says, you lack being. Isn't that what the serpent suggests to Eve? God doesn't want you to be like him. That's why he withholds. And when this sense of lack of being settles in, this is when we start looking around ourselves, trying to grasp for fruit that we think another is keeping from us. And so Girard had this beautiful insight that the conflict never begins with what the community says the problem was. Because although the story structure, according over all these different cultures, although the story structure follows the same path from chaos to a creative act of violence to peace restored, the reasons that they give for the chaos is always obscure. It's as if they blind to what caused it. We don't know why there's such chaos in our world. It's a monster out of the heavens or out of the sea. It suddenly came upon us. But the truth is that the chaos and the crisis we find ourselves in begins with our own desires. It begins with a humanity that actually doesn't know what they want. And when we don't know what we want, we look at our neighbors to inform us of what it is that we desire. And when we start looking at others to tell us what we desire, jealousy develops because they have what I think I lack. And so those very personal, individual conflicts keep growing and growing. And because this whole process is reflective, when the rivalry starts escalating, when I try and take from you what I think should belong to me, and you take back from me, when violence starts to escalate, the groups fighting become mirrors of one another. And so this is another beautiful insight that he gave, and this is, we don't fight because we are different. We fight because we are the same. Now, from the point of view of the person fighting, I cannot be more different than my rival. He is evil. He's the one doing the wrong thing. He's the reason for my lack. He's the one that's withholding what I need. He's the one that's causing me my conflict. From the point of view of the rival, it is always the difference between me and the other one that's the reason for the fight. But if we actually remove ourselves from that cycle and we look from the outside, we will see that the rivals are but mirrors of one another. They fight not because they are different. They fight because they are the same. And so within this community where conflict begins to rise, maybe I must tell you where this really hit home for me. We were invited a few years ago to minister on a cruise. We had to pray long and hard about it, but I felt the Lord said, yes, go for it. It was such fun. I actually just told our friends, yes, of course we'll come. And while we were on this cruise, it was the first time that I planned to speak about the whole subject of sacrifice and sacred violence. And I was reading Gerard's book, The Scapegoat. And one of the stories one of these ancient myths that he actually analyzes is of the ancient Mayan civilizations. And he was telling the story of how there was a real crisis. There was probably some kind of drought or something that diminished their food, that together with the fact that there was a solar eclipse, which, heightened the suspicion that the order is busy, our world is busy collapsing, meant the way in which they told the story is the gods were obviously upset. They were turning their face from us. Darkness is overcoming our world. We're not having food. What shall we do to make peace with the gods? And so they build a massive fire, and they asked for volunteers to sacrifice themselves to the gods. No volunteers were forthcoming immediately, but they found this one man sitting in a corner. And it's interesting, the description of the person they choose. He's somebody that's just a little bit different. Somebody that might not have all the family connections like the other people, or so that retribution would not be too much of a problem. Just somebody that's maybe a bit of an outsider. They saw this man sitting in the corner full of postulates on his face. Very often the person they choose to blame is different. They can either be very beautiful, the object of jealousy, or very ugly, the object of derision. So they can be outside, just different. So they asked this man, won't you sacrifice yourself and save our nation? And the man very bravely walked to the edge of the fire, but he did not have the courage to jump, so he retreated. And then they encouraged him again, and he walked to the edge of the fire, and he did not have the courage, so he retreated. But then on the third time, with the encouragement of his brothers, he jumped, sacrificed himself. The solar eclipse was over, the sun shone again, and the gods were appeased. Now, in that story, and in all the myths, we can say there's some things about the story that is true, and there's some things that we can say is not. And it's not true because we know who wrote the story. It wasn't the guy who jumped into the fire that wrote the story. It was the people who survived. And what we can say is probably fact is, yes, there was a crisis, and yes, somebody died. But what they called the encouragement of their brothers was probably a push. He didn't just heroically give himself to be sacrificed. And this is what we find in all the myths as well. The community who writes the myth is always innocent. And the person who suffered the consequences is always undoubtedly guilty, or another solution they found out was just he heroically sacrificed himself. But the community telling the story is never guilty of murder. It is always the fault or the heroic act of the outsider. Now, maybe we can pause at this moment and think how we tell our own stories. Do we sometimes, because of the confusion of what we desire, because of the whispering voice that has convinced us that we lack, do we, in that place of frustration, maybe not in such a physical and obvious way as these ancient myths, but do we also begin to search for scapegoats, for something outside of ourselves as the source of our frustration, as the source of our lack? So let's take it further. So they murder the scapegoat, peace descends, and these stories then become the origin myths of the new civilizations. And they become powerful narratives because they give our group a sense of identity. This is where we began. This is who we are. The gods favor us because we have overcome the monster of chaos. This is the very origin of religion, because the next time chaos descends upon our community, we remember what worked the previous time. What worked is we need to find somebody that's guilty of producing this chaos. We need to exile them out of our church, exile them out of our community, exile them out of, or sacrifice them in some way, and then peace will return. Isn't that the way many organizations still work today? We just need to find the guilty party, the reason for this chaos, get rid of them, and everything will be peaceful again. Now, the Gospels begin to unveil those areas in the myths where they avoided the truth. The Gospels begin to reveal it. So Jesus, he lands upon this planet at a time where it is absolute turmoil. A foreign power is in control of his country. His own nation is deeply divided. They fight amongst one another, and they can barely keep their nation together, their tradition together. And then there's the Roman powers. This is turmoil from every side. And in the midst of this, accusations begin to grow. This is a key component to mythology, is we need to accuse somebody of the problem. Very interesting, the word Satanos, long before it was personified as a name, is simply a noun. It means the accuser. The process of accusation. That is the most satanic thing you can involve yourself in. And so Jesus is in the midst of this community, and there's a specific story. It's just after the raising of Lazarus, where the Jews were pulling out their hair, and they're saying, everyone's listening to him now. Everyone's going after him. What should we do? And they go to Caiaphas, the head of the religious order, and they say, we can't do anything against him. And Caiaphas quiets them all down, and he says, you don't understand anything. Listen to me. It is better for one man to die for the nation than for the whole nation to perish. And right there, the truth about our mythology is unveiled. You see, in our mythology, the scapegoat is guilty. In the stories that we tell ourselves about our problems, our dissatisfactions, our frustrations, somebody else is guilty of what frustrates me. But Caiaphas reveals the truth, and the truth is this: we actually don't care about the guilt or the innocence of the one we accuse. All we care about is preserving the identity of our community. Have you heard stories later where the truth about the story is not that important? Where the facts about the guilt of somebody is not that important, as long as we have somebody to blame to preserve our identity and our sense of self. We side with Caiaphas. We say, actually, what matters is not whether he's guilty or innocent. What matters is that we preserve our identity, and we'll fabricate whatever needs to be fabricated. We'll tell whatever story needs to be told. We'll get whatever witnesses we need to get. But one thing Caiaphas guarantees to his community is he's going to die, not the community. Now, that way of telling our stories, the way in which we deal with chaos, with fear, with a sense of lack, with accusation, that will always produce new victims. And so Jesus in this drama ultimately takes on the place of the victim. He brings us face to face with our mythology. He brings us face to the face with the fact that God does not justify our accusations. God is not the one who justifies our violence. God is the one who suffers our violence. And for the first time in human history, it is revealed beyond doubt that our victim is innocent. Now, if our victim is innocent, it means we need to return to the source of this problem and find it somewhere else. Now, it's beautiful in Genesis. Genesis 1 begins to subvert the way in which we tell stories. It begins by introducing us to the same subjects. For instance, right in the beginning of Genesis 1, there is chaos. But very interestingly, for the first time in any mythology of that time, the chaos is not an enemy. And the chaos is not overcome by violence. Rather, Elohim hovers in silent contemplation. That beautiful song Marianne just did. Won't you be quiet for a moment? Just hover over that chaos. Don't allow it to instill a sense of fear, a sense of lack of identity. Don't react to the chaos. Just hover. Let Elohim help you see the possibilities for new meaning, the possibilities for a new story, without having to produce new villains, without having to incite anger and frustration and violence at others. You know, I want to take this quickly to the second part of this. So we've started touching on that, but that is how Jesus gives us a new way of telling our story. And the way in which I want to show how he does that is in John 20. I think it's from verse 19. You know, this is after the resurrection. And the disciples are fearful because the power of the Roman Empire and the power of their own religious institutions has come down hard upon their movement. They've taken their leader, Jesus, they've crucified him. And these disciples, what do? What we all do in a time of crisis. They run to a little room in which they can lock the door, hide themselves. This room of fear, this room of insecurity, and it's in the midst of that they say, what will we do? Where will we go? And in that place where they are now going to start producing their new stories of why we need to isolate ourselves and protect ourselves, Jesus arrives, Jesus appears in their midst. And the first words he speaks to them is peace. Peace be unto you. Then he continues and he breathes on them a new spirit. You see, what is the spirit that produced these other stories of accusation, of guilt, of conflict? It's the stories that we find described in 1 John, where he says, all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, all these things pass away. Do you remember what is the origin of the conflict? It's twisted desire. It's the same story as in Genesis 3, when out of a sense of lack, I grasp for what I think is withheld from me. That twisted desire is the source of our frustration. And so the way in which 1 John 2 describes it is this: the desires of the eyes, the desires for power, this twisting of desire, it is passing away. But those who do the desire of their Father will endure forever. And so Jesus stands in front of his disciples and he says, receive my spirit. This is a different spirit that doesn't make you huddle in fear in your little community, but rather it's a spirit that so fills you up, that so wells up, rises up within you, that Jesus can say, now you go. Go into all the world. You've got no reason to fear this world. You've got no reason to, out of a sense of lack, isolate yourself, but rather out of a sense of overwhelming fullness. You can now go to the world and represent me. Be me. The way I was in the world, I want you to be in this world. And how was Jesus in the world? He carries on a few verses later. You remember that verse? Many of our translations still has it translated this way: if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. And if you retain the sins of any, they are retained. There's many scholars that will tell you the actual accurate translation of that verse sounds more like this: go and forgive the sins of many, and whoever you hold will be held. That last part of the sentence has got nothing to do with retaining sin. It's the same word where Jesus says, Father, those you have given me, I have held, and I have not let them go. I have not lost any of them. It's that word for embrace. So Jesus is commissioned to these people who are huddling in their fear in the upper room. His commandment is this: I breathe into you a spirit that will go into this world, that will embrace them and demonstrate to them my acceptance, my embrace. Make that your story. And so, in conclusion, I just want to say this, my friends. We are all bombarded with media stories day in and day out. And I was reminded at the beginning of this year, I did a little video on joy, which was exactly this idea: that if we just subject ourselves to the narratives that are being enforced upon us, the result is going to not be joy. It's going to be confusion. It's going to be fear. It's going to be frustration, because that is the spirit of this world system. If you find yourself involved in stories, whether it's stories that come through the media or whether it's the stories that you are generating yourself, that's busy with accusation, that's busy with finding the guilty parties, and stories that, especially if you find a community that can join in with your story, where we develop a sense of identity because of this story. If your story is a story in which others are always guilty and you are always innocent, You are busy with mythology. The story of Jesus brings us face to face with a new way of being human, a way in which we do not have to accuse anyone. You see, in the resurrection, Jesus doesn't come to those who have murdered him and killed him and said, now it's my turn. No, Jesus comes with no retribution, and he actually invites everyone, the perpetrators of violence and those who suffered violence, to transform their thinking. Yes, there's a place where perpetrators need to acknowledge what they've done. Yes, there's a place where the victims need to experience that realization of truth. But then Jesus invites both perpetrators and victims to transcend these categories. Whether you're a perpetrator or a victim, neither one of those categories should be your identity. He's calling you to transform your way of thinking so that you are no longer formed by violence. You see, both perpetrators and victims have been formed through the violence they've done or that was done to them. But Jesus introduces us to a new way of understanding ourselves and others. And so as the one innocent victim, he forgives and he invites us to enter into that same realm where we're no longer trapped in the cycle of victimizers and victims, but the place where we once again can acknowledge that the image and likeness of the God of love, the one who desires us, has found fulfillment in human form. And he invites us to live out of that fullness, out of that sense of completeness. I want to give you just a moment or two to, if you have questions, to formulate your questions, while I ask Mary Ann to just do a concluding song. And then after the song, I'm going to open it up for discussion and questions.